What's going on, everyone? My name is Jasmine. On today's episode of the Slam Project, we're going to be talking about the Saskatoon Starlight Tours. And basically, what these are the freezing deaths of Indigenous men on the outskirts of the city, allegedly at the hands of the Saskatoon PD. And there is only circumstantial evidence, so nobody has ever been charged with their deaths. And just a warning, I am going to be speaking of the victims' alcohol and drug use, and it is not an attempt to shame them, but to give you a clear picture of exactly what was going on. And today's video is going to be split into three parts. We're going to go over the cases of Rodney Naistus, Darrell NIght, and Lawrence Wegner. And then we're going to go over pieces of their cases that do not make any sense. And then in the back half of the video, we're going to be talking about Neil Stonechild. Don't forget to check out my other videos. And if you want to see more videos on missing and murdered Indigenous people, click that subscribe button and the notification bell. Now let's get right into it. The Saskatoon Starlight Tours, also known as the Saskatoon Freezing Deaths, are a series of deaths involving intoxicated Indigenous men who were found on the outskirts of the city frozen to death. For decades, the local Indigenous population had heard stories about the Saskatoon Police Service picking up people and dumping them off in sub-zero temperatures, leaving them stranded. Some made it home and some died. There were hardly adequate investigations into these deaths, and they were summed up to them getting drunk and walking off into the night, miles outside of the city. And although it was obvious that these people would have froze to death before being found where they were, the police never tried to explain how this could have happened. However, nothing could ever be proven due to lack of investigation, and these incidences continued. That all changed in the year 2000, when an Indigenous man named Darrell NIght survived one of these ordeals, and it blew the lid off all the wrongdoings that had been happening for years. Racial tensions in the city were at an all-time high after Darrell NIght came forward with his story. Saskatoon has a history of violence against Native people. In the early 90s, a man named John Martin Crawford targeted Native women and girls. The bodies of Shelley Napope, Kalinda Waterhen, and Eva Taysup were found southwest of the city. They disappeared in the downtown area of Saskatoon, where two of these men were last seen. A woman named Shirley Lone Thunder, who disappeared in 1991, is still missing and is presumed to be one of his victims. Please go to episode 29 for a detailed account of this case. In the year 2000, when the cluster of the freezing deaths that are going to be discussed in this video happened, the Saskatoon Police Service came under fire because they were using a lifelike image of an Indigenous-looking woman for target practice at their shooting range. The poster was created by the Saskatchewan Police College in Regina and distributed to police agencies across Saskatchewan. The director of the college defended the poster by saying it was a Caucasian lady, but that is up for interpretation. The poster was eventually discontinued because of the public outcry. In 2016, the Saskatoon Police Service came under fire again after it was discovered that someone from within the station had removed the Starlight Tours from its Wikipedia page. An IP address from the station was linked to the deletion, but it is unknown who made the change. The Starlight Tours will always be a part of Saskatoon history that nobody can erase, and even to this day, some people deny that they ever happened. But in June 1997, Constable Brian Traynor, who worked for the Saskatoon PD, used to write for the humor column in the Saskatoon Sun. He coincidentally drew a cartoon that depicts police officers taking a man outside of town and abandoning him at the Queen Elizabeth Power Station. It was supposed to be fictional, but it had striking similarities to what would unfold in the year 2000. The following is a tangled web of mystery, hate, racism, corruption, abuse of powers, and disregard for human life. This is the story of the Saskatoon Starlight Tours. Rodney Naistus was a 25-year-old man from the Onion Lake First Nation. Everyone close to him called him Stephen. He was recently convicted of break-in and entering and theft. He was released from Saskatoon's Correctional Center's urban camp on Thursday, January 27, 2000, after serving 7 months. Corrections staff bought him a bus ticket home and dropped him off at the bus station. Rodney decided to cash in the ticket to go see his cousin Charlene and her boyfriend Rodney, who lived in Saskatoon. His older brother Darrell was also there. The brothers were close growing up, and the pair were shuffled through group homes in their youth. The plan was that the brothers were going to wait for Darrell to get a check in the mail so they both could catch a bus back to Onion Lake First Nation together. The next day, on Friday, January 28, 2000, Rodney spent the day drinking and smoking some marijuana to celebrate his release from jail. He was with his brother, cousin, and her boyfriend. They first went to the Red Rock Grill at 2305 22nd West Street at around 3 p.m. They drank and played pool there, and Rodney befriended a man there named Pat, who was having a night out before starting a bricklaying job in Calgary. Rodney and his relatives only had a few beers apiece here, as they were on limited funds. They all left the bar on foot at about 8 p.m. and went to Charlene's brother's apartment at 137 Avenue T South. This was about a 7-minute walk and across the street from Pleasant Hill Park. They drank there until 11 p.m. They then caught a taxi and bought beer nearby at Booney's at 3330 Fairlight Drive before returning to Charlene's apartment at 26 Maxwell Crescent. Rodney and his new friend Pat still wanted to go clubbing and hopefully meet some girls. They left to go to Jack's nightclub at 302 Pacific Avenue between 11:30 p.m. and midnight. Charlene tried to get Rodney to stay, but he insisted on going. Rodney and Pat caught a bus from 33rd Avenue near Charlene's to the nightclub downtown, but Rodney could not get in because he was too drunk and did not meet the dress code. They then decided to walk nearby to Winston's Pub located at the Senator Hotel, and they drank there until closing. By this time, it was 2 a.m. on Saturday, January 29, 2000. Pat met a woman while at the pub, and they decided to head to Diva's nightclub, but she didn't want Rodney to go with them. She gave him the beer she was drinking before they left without him. At Diva's, they could not get in because they were too intoxicated, and they decided to go back for Rodney at Winston's Pub, but he was gone by the time they got there. Eyewitness reports later confirm that after walking away from Winston's Pub, Rodney walked a block away to Seaweed's nightclub, which was a country western themed bar. A lady who was working coat check described a unique jacket Rodney was wearing, and the bouncer identified him from a photo lineup. After Seaweed's closed at 3 a.m., carloads of people left the nightclub and headed to a house party that had already been going on for hours at 725 Weldon Avenue. An estimated 50 people were at the house party that had spread out to the front lawn and into the street. This house was well known to the Saskatoon Police Service. In fact, on the same day as the party, they were called there at 10:15 p.m. on January 28th for a noise complaint. They were then called again later for a sexual assault call. I am not 100% sure, but the latter could be why the party eventually was broken up. It has never been confirmed if Rodney was ever at this party. People that attended the party could not say for sure if he was there, or some of them simply did not want to speak to the police about it. But what is known for certain is that Rodney did not make it back to his cousin Charlene's after his night out. On Saturday, January 29, 2000, Saskatoon MLA Pat Lorhe was out for her weekly run with her neighbor's Dalmatian. She approached a feed store called Shamrock Feeds, located at 2435 Schuler Street, at about the same time someone was arriving for work. This store has since been renamed several times, but is now called Master Feeds. Upon approaching the building, they both saw someone lying in the snow near the building. Pat described the body as being frozen blue with thin clothing and a jacket that was pulled up around the neck. There were also frozen tears on the face of this person, and she knew immediately that they were Indigenous. She called 911 from her cell phone at 10:56 a.m. and said officers responded quickly to the scene. She stayed there for about 3 hours to make sure she was there to answer any questions they had. Police responded, and this turned out to be the lifeless body of Rodney Naistus. The area at the time was industrial, with only a few buildings nearby. Today, however, there are many other businesses near the feed store. The location of the feed store is southwest of the party on Weldon, in a direction that goes further outside of the city limits and is about 2 kilometers away. Rodney was described as wearing black windbreaker pants that were over a pair of jeans and white Nike shoes. There was a camouflage shirt next to the body and another one about 30 feet away with a baseball cap. The jacket found on Rodney matches the description the coat checker gave at Seaweeds. Footprints in the snow indicated that Rodney had walked along the fence line west of the feed store. He then walked into an open field and was sometimes on his hands and knees. Rodney then returned to the feed store before collapsing. He also vomited before he started to shed his clothes. These are all classic symptoms of hypothermia, and it appears Rodney was desperately trying to get out of the cold. 2 responding officers, Sergeant Philip Ferrion and Sergeant Bob Peters, both said that there was no sign of violence or trauma to the body. However, one responding officer, Constable Mitch Uzepski, gave a more detailed report. He said that Rodney was found flat on his back, with his head facing southeast and his legs facing northwest. The constable also noted that, quote, there appeared to be a small amount of dried blood around his nose and fluid leaking out of the left corner of his mouth, end quote. He was the only officer to make note of the blood around Rodney's nose. His footprints were tracked back from where he was found, and the furthest they could be traced was to Dudley Street and Avenue U before being lost in the hard-packed snow. This was just over a half kilometer and halfway between the house party on Weldon and the feed store. An autopsy was conducted by Dr. Terrence Moyana, and they concluded that Rodney undressed in cold weather, had non-lethal toxicology, and was absent from injuries. The final ruling was hypothermia. The temperature on the night he went missing was negative 16 degrees Celsius. There is more to report on Rodney's case, and we will get into this a little later. Darrell NIght was 33 years old and originally from the Saulteaux First Nation near North Battleford, Saskatchewan. The same day Rodney was released from jail, on Thursday, January 27, 2000, Darrell was also drinking in Saskatoon. Darrell was staying with his sister at the time at an apartment building located at 136 Avenue U South, which is directly across the street from Pleasant Hill Park. That day he gave his sister some grocery money before walking to Red Rock Grill, which was about a 7-minute walk. When he arrived, his brother Merv and cousin Harry were shooting some pool. They stayed for a while and then headed over to Seaweed's nightclub until closing time at 3 a.m. Darrell's uncle Leo was having a party that night. It was decided that that was the next stop, but first Darrell tried to go over to the Berry Hotel to buy some more beer. It was closed, so he bought 2 bottles of vodka from a bootlegger. Darrell, his brother Merv, and cousin Harry all caught a taxi over to the house party. Uncle Leo's apartment building was located at Avenue T and 20th Street West, which was only a few blocks from Darrell's sister's apartment. Her apartment was just around the corner from where Rodney Naistus was drinking with his cousins. At around 5 a.m. on January 28th, 2 women at the party began fighting. The fight started when one of the women got up to leave and her purse was missing. Things started to get pretty wild, so Darrell decided it was time to leave. He was trying to make it back to his sister's place so he could pass out. Darrell was quite drunk when he left the party. The temperature at the time was minus 22 degrees Celsius. Darrell was only wearing a button-up shirt, a jean jacket, and running shoes. He did not have on a hat or gloves. When walking out of the apartment building, he saw a police car. Officers Dan Hatchin and Ken Munson were responding to a complaint about the fight upstairs. Darrell started cussing at them, flipped them off, and told them it was about time they showed up and that they should get up there and break up the fight. Instead, they placed handcuffs on him and latched them pretty tight. They then threw him in the back of the car. He figured they were taking him to the drunk tank, and he didn't mind because his sister told him not to come back drunk. Darrell asked what was going on, and one of the officers just said he was under arrest and did not explain the charges. Darrell then remembers them detouring for a call in Riversdale, and then from there east on 11th Street. It is important to note that 11th Street eventually runs into Weldon Street, the same street where the house party was where Rodney was thought to have been. The police car then hit the riverbank of the South Saskatchewan River and drove south on Spadina Crescent West, going further outside the city. Darrell had heard stories of the Starlight Tours and began to worry. He wasn't sure if these stories were true or if they were just drunk talk, but he was starting to get really nervous about the situation. He tried to mention that he was childhood friends with a cop, hoping that it would make them second guess what he thought they were about to do. As the car kept going further out of town, Darrell began to get so scared that it started to sober him up. At the intersection of Dundonald Avenue and Spadina Crescent West, the car came to a stop about 50 meters from a trailer court, and one of the officers pulled Darrell out of the car. The officer called him a drunk Indian and said other racial insults towards him. They then threw him on the hood of the car and took the handcuffs off. They then hopped back in the car and began to slowly pull away. Darrell yelled at them that he would freeze to death. They stopped the car and rolled down the window. One of them said, "That's your fucking problem," and drove away. Darrell was quick-witted though. He was able to see their car number and memorize it before they drove away into the night. This would help him later. To the left of him was the city dump, and to the right was the South Saskatchewan River. With all the lights out at the trailer court, Darrell began walking towards town. He saw lights off into the distance that belonged to the Queen Elizabeth Power Station, which was about a kilometer away. With the bitter cold and inadequate clothing, this was a very long distance. By the time Darrell arrived at the power station, his ears, hands, and feet were numb, and he was beginning to feel warm, which are all symptoms of hypothermia. He could not make a fist to knock because his hands were too cold. He then used his feet to knock on the door, but his feet were also numb, so he wasn't sure how hard he was pounding. Nobody was answering his knocks at the door, so he decided to try another door on the west side of the building. There was still no answer, and he was starting to get desperate. He thought about breaking a window to try to get in, but he didn't want the same officers to come back if a break-in and enter-in call was received. Finally, an engineer at the power plant named Mark Evoy was dropping off paperwork to the offices in the front of the building and spotted Darrell. By this time it was 6 a.m. and Darrell had been outside from 30 to 45 minutes. The worker let him in the door and asked him what he was doing. Darrell explained the situation and Mark called Darrell a taxi back to his sister's place. The worker and taxi records would later confirm that this happened. Taxi driver John Friesen arrived at 6:15 a.m. to give Darrell a ride. On his way to the power plant, he was wondering if a worker was the one needing a ride home. When Darrell got into the taxi, he could smell alcohol on him. John joked and said, "I didn't know that they let you drink on the job." Darrell then began to tell him what happened on the drive home. Once there, Darrell did not have the $10 to pay the fare and left his jacket and health card with the driver so he could go inside and get some money from his sister. Darrell returned with the cash and collected his jacket. His health card fell out on the floor of the taxi and the driver found it later and kept it for Darrell. But once at home, Darrell told his family what had happened but did not tell the police. But why would he? 2 Saskatoon police officers just attempted to leave him for dead. Darrell felt as if he could not trust anyone within the police force. He remained quiet for the time being, but shit was about to hit the fan. About 30 hours later, the body of Rodney Naistus would be found within a couple miles of the power station. And a third man is believed to have a run-in with Saskatoon police in just as many days. Lawrence Wegner was a 30-year-old man who was also from the Saulteaux First Nation, just like Darrell NIght. His father was a German man and his mother was First Nations. His parents described him as being a highly intelligent person who learned things easily throughout his whole life. Lawrence struggled with mental health issues and drug addictions. He lived in a Saskatoon group home for mentally handicapped people for the last 3 years of his life. Lawrence was being prescribed many different drugs at the time, and he was evicted from the group home for stealing his prescriptions from the drug cabinet for the 3rd time. He went to stay with some friends he knew on Avenue P South. The man and woman who lived there were in a relationship and also used street drugs. They also had a history of domestic violence. This residence was not checked or approved by the group home before Lawrence moved in. They just sort of evicted him and threw him out on the street without a safe place to go. But Lawrence lived a double life. He was attending college at the Saskatchewan Indian Federated College. He was studying social work. Many of his classmates did not know that he used drugs and remember him as a dedicated student who took his studies seriously. Lawrence was last seen by his classmates on Sunday, January 30th, 2000. Afterwards, he was back at his new apartment with his roommates. They all began getting high. The 3 were with an unnamed man, and they were using cocaine, morphine, and various pills. Sometime after 8 p.m., Lawrence's roommates began fighting, so he left with this unnamed person. This would be the last confirmed sighting of him by his roommates. When Lawrence left, he borrowed a jacket and boots from his roommate. Within an hour, the unnamed person he was with was admitted to the St. Paul's Hospital for a drug overdose and would remain there until the next day. No exact time was given, but around midnight on January 30th going into the 31st, 4 different people say that they saw someone fitting Lawrence's description being thrown into the back of a police car at the hospital. They all said that the man did not have on shoes or a jacket. 2 women who witnessed this and knew Lawrence came forward and helped create a composite sketch of the officer they saw throw Lawrence in the back of the car. However, this sketch was reportedly only shown to a senior officer who said that it did not look like anyone under his command. This sketch was then placed under a publication ban and was not allowed to be released to the public at the time. These sightings have never been confirmed to be of Lawrence because all 4 of these people's claims were dismissed. Only one of the women who provided the sketch was allowed to testify at a coroner's inquiry later in early 2002. There were a few other unconfirmed sightings of Lawrence after his supposed run-in with police at the hospital. These alleged sightings show him moving out of town on foot for over an hour. But Lawrence knew Saskatoon well, and there was no logical reason for him to be walking that far out of town. He was a drug user and high at the time, but his roommate is on the record saying that Lawrence could handle his drugs well. He gave an example of Lawrence going to sleep after taking acid one time. This drug usually wires people out, and they are awake for hours on end. Hypothermia develops when body temperature reaches 35 degrees Celsius or 95 degrees Fahrenheit. The chart posted here is a frostbite chart for exposed facial skin. Factor in individuals not dressed to be outside for long periods and alcohol use, and the time the frostbite in hypothermia is much faster. At 12:20 a.m. on January 31st, about 20 to 30 minutes after the hospital sighting, Jennifer and Eliza Whitecap, who were mother and daughter, called a non-emergency number to report that a man was banging on their door and yelling pizza. They were told that officers were already looking for a person fitting this description. One of them looked out the window and recognized the man as her cousin Lawrence Wegner. This was on 20th Street, a few blocks from the hospital, and they said that when he left, he was going in the direction of the hospital. He was only wearing t-shirt jeans, and sources are conflicted on the matter of him wearing shoes or not. He began his way down the street before they realized who he was. The next-door neighbor of the Whitecaps also reported looking out their window and seeing a man in the back of a police cruiser. They could not remember the exact time or date, and it was never specified if this person could have been Lawrence. Sergeant Bruce Morseland, who took the call reporting the man yelling pizza, later testified that he issued a be on the lookout for, or both, for the man pounding on the door, but no record of this could be found. A recording of the call was later entered as evidence, and according to Sergeant Morseland and the Whitecaps, important information was missing, such as the name and address given during the call. The address would have had to been requested because they could not have that information automatically because the call was not placed directly to 911. Along with the missing bulf issued by Sergeant Bruce Morseland, it appears as if important pieces of evidence were coming up missing. But Sergeant Morseland tried to explain this by saying that the call center that took the complaint would sometimes have problems recording the calls and that he had notified his superiors about the problem. He also said that he could not have put out the bulf alert if officers had already said that they located the suspect, but he could not remember if this happened. Another sergeant named Kirk Dyke, who oversees training 911 operators and troubleshooting the police communication system, said that no such complaints about the system were made, and that it would be impossible to edit parts of the tape unless it was cut and spliced by hand. He also claimed that in the 10 years overseeing that department, it has never failed and was only down for scheduled maintenance. But on the tape, there was a noticeable click between a question Sergeant Morseland asked and Whitecap's answer, which led investigators at the coroner's inquiry to believe the tape had been tampered with. Sergeant Dyke went on to say that the tapes are locked in his storage room and only accessible to 6 senior members, including himself. Sergeant Dyke seemingly attacked Sergeant Morseland's credibility on everything he said on the stand. He said that Morseland was assigned to the call center for medical reasons and that he had received numerous complaints about him from other staff over the way he handles calls. With that being said, did the call to police from the Whitecaps happen before or after the alleged sightings of Lawrence at the hospital? Did this happen first and then he made his way back to the hospital where his friend was being treated for an overdose? Remember, the time of the hospital sighting was only stated as around midnight, and the call happened at 12:20 a.m. And it is very important to note here that some sources say the call actually happened sometime between 11 p.m. and midnight. But the 12:20 a.m. time is what was referenced at the inquiry, so this is what I went with. If the tape was tampered with, was it to muddy the timeline of Lawrence's movements, to make it seem like he was traveling after 4 witnesses reported seeing him being placed in the back of a police cruiser at the hospital? But the Saskatoon police never admitted any of their members had picked Lawrence up at the hospital. So was the tape ever tampered with at all? One last thing on the hospital sighting. Why weren't the cameras checked and entered into evidence? Even though this happened in the year 2000, I still believe that almost all hospitals had security cameras at all entrances and inside. Another sighting was just after 1 a.m. A man reported seeing a man walking without a jacket on Avenue W along the railroad tracks. Then at 1:15 a.m., 2 truck drivers say that they drove past a man who was wearing a white t-shirt. He was walking south along Dundonald Avenue. A set of railroad tracks run parallel to this street. If these sightings were Lawrence, it is possible he could have followed the railroad tracks near Avenue W to another set of tracks that run south along Dundonald. None of these people stopped to check on this person or called the police to report an improperly dressed person out in the bitter cold. Lawrence's classmates became concerned when he missed school the following Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. This was totally unlike him because he was a dedicated student. Lawrence Wegner's body was found by railway workers on Thursday, February 3, 2000. He was wearing only a t-shirt and jeans, and his socks were clean and did not have any holes in them. It did not appear that he was walking on them at all. This location was right next to the Queen Elizabeth Power Station and almost 5 kilometers from the Whitecaps on 20th Street, where the police were called for someone pounding on the door. Lawrence's boots and jacket were never found. Now at this exact point in time, Darrell NIght still had not yet reported what had happened to him to the Saskatoon Police Service. He was well aware of the bodies of Rodney and Lawrence being found frozen near the area he was dumped off at. The same day Lawrence's body was found on Thursday, February 3rd, Darrell and his uncle were pulled over by Sergeant Bruce Ehalt for a seatbelt violation. The uncle asked the police officer if the body found that day had been identified. He was asked why he wanted to know, and he explained what happened to his nephew Darrell. Sergeant Ehalt urged Darrell to file a complaint, and his response was, "Who's going to believe me?" Sergeant Ehalt was good police and told Darrell that he needed some time and he needed to speak to Chief Dave Scott about it. Darrell and his uncle went on their way and didn't expect anything to come from this. The Saskatoon police chief was made aware of Darrell's incident the next day, on Friday, February 4th. This is when Sergeant Ehalt found Darrell in front of his uncle's apartment. He motioned for Darrell to come over to him, and Darrell was scared. He thought maybe the police wanted to silence him for good. But Sergeant Ehalt told Darrell that he believed him. Darrell then went to the police station with his uncle and filed his complaint. This went off like an explosion inside the police station, and that explosion blew outside into the city. Almost everyone had an opinion about this, and Darrell started receiving death threats. The platoon of officers who worked the night Darrell was taken outside of the city were brought behind closed doors and questioned. Darrell gave the wrong police card number, and other officers were being blamed for what happened to him. On Monday, February 7th, 2000, Senior Constables Ken Munson and Dan Hatchett came forward and admitted to abandoning Darrell. Police Chief Dave Scott held a press conference and did not say that the officers admitted to taking Darrell and did not deny it when asked by reporters. He did, however, say that the officers were suspended with pay, agreed to take a polygraph test, and nothing ties them to the deaths of Rodney Naistus and Lawrence Wegner. He stated at the press conference that the Saskatoon Police Service would head the investigation into their own officers. This decision would later be reversed later in the day, and it was announced that the RCMP would lead the investigation. The Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations, or FSIN, also started their own task force and closely monitored the RCMP's investigation. They also assigned their own investigator to the case and supplied attorneys. They set up a tip line to gather complaints against the police and received over 800 reports within the first few weeks. Many of the people who called in the complaints never formally filed them because they were fearful of the police. The RCMP began their investigation into the deaths of Rodney Naistus, Lawrence Wegner, and the incident with Darrell NIght on Thursday, February 17, 2000. This investigation was called Project Ferric, which soon grew to include the case of Neil Stonechild. This investigation eventually concluded that there was no basis for criminal charges in the deaths of Rodney and Lawrence, but a coroner's inquest was ordered in both cases. Rodney Naistus' inquest began in late 2001, and Lawrence Wegner's began in January 2002. Neil Stonechild would also get a separate inquiry which began in February 2003. Police Chief Scott was fired and a new chief named Russell Sabo stepped in. He did his best to manage all the chaos that was happening. He had the support of the indigenous community and was sworn in with a traditional ceremony. He first stated that these freezing deaths were isolated incidents, but soon backtracked and said that there was other cases, and the oldest was known to be in the 1970s. As other cases were being examined, they came up with a strong candidate for police misconduct. A 17-year-old boy named Neil Stonechild was found frozen to death on the northern edge of Saskatoon in 1990. This case would also be reinvestigated to determine if the police were involved in his death. One of Chief Sabo's first actions was to create a community liaison officer, and he assigned Constable Larry Hartwig to the position. He was assigned to a newly created police station in the middle of the city called the Little Police Chief Station. This was an effort to get to know the community and build a trusting relationship with them. Constable Hartwig took pride in his new position, and in a November 2002 interview, he stated that he worked on 3 different reserves and had developed a healthy respect for the Aboriginal community. He also stated that it was important not to ever abuse your power as a police officer because you have the power to destroy lives. We will come back to Larry Hartwig shortly. Key factors from the investigation into the Darrell NIght incident not discussed yet are: the officers who took Darrell worked the next day when Rodney Naistus disappeared. They, however, did not work the night Lawrence Wegner vanished. When they picked Darrell up, they never ran his name through the Canadian Police Information Center, better known as CPIC. This is proper procedure when someone is arrested. They did not record Darrell's name anywhere in their notebooks. Constables Munson and Hansen admitted they drove Darrell to Dundonald Avenue and Spadina Crescent West and dropped him off there. This is a little over 1 kilometer from the power station. They claim that Darrell did not want to go to jail and asked to be let off anywhere. They thought he would be okay if they let him out there, even with the clothing he was wearing. They figured he could calm down on the long walk home in negative 22 degrees Celsius weather. When the bodies of the others were found, the constables thought of Darrell, but did not check the computer because it would have been recorded. In September 2001, Darrell NIght testified at the trials of Constable Munson and Hatchett. He wore the shoes he had on the night he was abandoned. He called them his lucky shoes. Ken Munson compared the whole ordeal to taking a dog out for a walk. He was referring to letting Darrell walk to blow off steam. His lawyer made another disturbing comparison, saying it was like sending a child to their room for misbehaving. This was also in reference to Darrell's temper. The defense lawyer attacked Darrell's credibility and pointed things out like being on social assistance and being an admitted alcoholic. They tried saying that Darrell was mad the night he was picked up because he wanted to continue drinking, but the party was ruined because of the fight. They then tried to say that he resisted arrest because of this. They read his entire arrest record to the year 1996 when all charges stopped. It was pointed out that on February 1, 2000, a few days after being left for dead, Darrell called 911 to request help after getting into a fight with someone. He asked if the operator was white and called 4 different times because help was taking too long. He then said he would get a gun and shoot someone. Darrell did admit that was his voice on the tape, but said he was blacked out drunk and did not remember making the calls. The defense said Darrell was dangerous when he was drunk. They were somehow trying to find a way to blame Darrell for what happened to him, but the defense never challenged if the constables took Darrell because they admitted to doing so. Officers Munson and Hatchett were eventually found guilty of unlawful confinement and not guilty of assault. In my opinion, the charges should have been kidnapping and attempted murder. They were fired from the force and only sentenced to 8 months in jail and only served half of that sentence. The coroner's inquest into the death of Rodney Naistus and Lawrence Wegner soon began. The purpose of such an inquest is to establish the place, time, and cause of death. The jury hearing the testimony and evidence cannot assign blame or criminal responsibility. And there was concern about these inquiries because certain pieces of evidence and eyewitness testimony were withheld from the jury. Key factors not yet discussed in Rodney Naistus' case are: his name was never run through CPIC. All the call logs from Central Dispatch were examined and indicated that no calls pertaining to Rodney were received. All officers of Platoon A were questioned and no one admitted to having contact with him. Platoon A was the same crew that was working the previous day when Darrell was abandoned by the Queen Elizabeth Power Plant. March 13, 2000. Constables Munson and Hatchett were given polygraph exams and passed. This was scrutinized because only 3 simple questions were asked. Also, no questions about Darrell NIght were allowed to be asked. DNA tests were done on a pair of handcuffs, and samples found did not match Rodney or Lawrence Wegner. Other items were also tested, and Rodney could not be excluded as being a donor on one of the samples. This item was not specified and only means that Rodney may have been in the vehicle. The officers' dispatch records were released, and there was a noticeable 1-hour time gap between calls. At 3:20 a.m. on January 29, 2000, the officers did a CPIC search for 3 men. The next call is logged at 4:49 a.m. when they responded to a domestic violence call. Alberta's chief medical examiner examined photos of Rodney and made note of the blood around his nose and mouth. This was only the second time this ever came up. Even his autopsy did not mention this. This bleeding has never been explained. When Rodney's cousin Charlene was questioned about Rodney, she was asked some bizarre questions. Sergeant Chuckley Rat asked if Rodney was in the habit of walking out to the landfill and picking up bottles. He was trying to suggest he was found frozen in that area because he was trying to get to the landfill to collect bottles to recycle. This was implying he was trying to do this in the middle of the night. She was also asked if Rodney was slow, meaning unintelligent. It was implied that he was confused and could not tell that the numbered streets were leading him further out of town. One of Rodney's uncles stated that he knew Saskatoon well, and there was no reason for him to be walking that way. The final conclusion by the inquiry into his death was that Rodney attended the party on Welding Avenue and walked away and died of hypothermia. His family and several others believe that he was taken on a Starlight tour. The details pertaining to Lawrence Wegner's case, not yet discussed, are as follows. His name was never run through CPIC, and no officers admitted to seeing him that night. No officers were asked to take polygraphs because their statements were consistent about not seeing Lawrence the night he disappeared. There were 1 centimeter abrasions on Lawrence's wrist that were noticed at autopsy. The pathologist who examined him testified that he was unable to tell if they came from handcuffs. Sergeant Dyke demonstrated with a pair of handcuffs for the jury and said that Lawrence's wrist would have been injured if tossed into the back of the police cruiser, making it seem like the injuries would have been obvious and not up for debate. Lawrence's family claimed to have seen cuts on the back of his head when they identified his body, and this was disputed by the pathologist who said there were no such injuries. There was a 4 by 6 centimeter bruise on his forehead that was summed up to him falling to the ground when he succumbed to hypothermia. The Saskatoon police admitted to contaminating the scene where Lawrence was found by walking around his body before the head of investigation arrived to videotape the scene. The sketch created that I spoke of earlier was shown at the inquest, and the woman who saw Lawrence put in the back of the police car says it was not the same sketch she signed off on. She then created a new sketch herself to show what the police officer looked like. She also was never offered a photo lineup of police officers to see if she could identify the person she claimed to have seen. I have also read that this woman knew Darrell NIght and did not come forward until the coroner's inquiry began in early 2002. This is understandable because she was fearful of the consequences of coming forward. Afterward, she had to have a police cruiser bring her kids to and from school, and the family kept a low profile. There reportedly were bloodstains on his t-shirt. Because Saskatoon police did not suspect foul play, Lawrence's clothes were turned over to his family at the morgue. The t-shirt, jeans, and a double pair of socks were washed by his family. The RCMP asked for these items when they began investigating, and his family could not tell which pair of socks were worn on the outside because there were no visible wear on them, so they only gave them 1 pair. Lead RCMP investigator Kirk Hopkins failed to bring the socks to the coroner's inquiry, so the jury was unable to see this piece of evidence, but I do believe there was photos of the socks. When Coroner Hugh Herodance gave instructions to the jury before they left to deliberate Lawrence's cause of death, he told them if they find that police did have contact with him, does it prove they took him anywhere? The coroner also expressed his doubts to the jury about the credibility of the witnesses that were allowed to testify. This included the woman who helped create the sketch. The caregiver at Lawrence's group home said she received calls immediately following his death from a police sergeant, and her caller ID displayed the Saskatoon Police Department. She gave this man telephone interviews every day for about a week. He wanted to know everything she knew about Lawrence and his last movements. The call stopped and she called the police station to speak to this man and was told that there was no one there with that name and that no one had called her since Lawrence's body was found. She was told at the inquiry that she could not bring this incident up unless she was asked. It never came up in the questioning, and the jury never heard about this mystery caller. The final result of the coroner's investigation into Lawrence Wegner's death was undetermined. The jury could not explain how he died or how he ended up near the power plant. Lawrence's mother, Mary, was a strong woman. Even though she missed Lawrence every day of her life, she has said she didn't blame the police for her son's death and that everything happens for a reason. She believed that the truth would be revealed one day, and she stated perhaps someone would give a deathbed confession and admit he was in fact taken on a Starlight tour. She passed away in 2019 and joined her husband and Lawrence in heaven. Now let's backtrack to Constable Larry Hartwig. He was the newly appointed community liaison officer that was assigned to the Little Chief police station. When the RCMP began investigating the deaths of Rodney and Lawrence and what happened to Darrell, they began interviewing officers within the Saskatoon Police Service. They asked the question if anyone knew of any other similar cases that had happened in the past. In the spring of 2000, during an interview, Larry Hartwig brought up the name Neil Stonechild. As the RCMP investigated this, Larry Hartwig was subsequently interviewed almost a dozen times over the course of a couple years because they suspected he knew more about Neil. Neil Stonechild was also a member of the Saulteaux First Nation and is always described as friendly, outgoing, and well-liked. His mother Stella moved the family to Saskatoon in 1980 from Thompson, Manitoba, to escape problems caused by alcohol abuse. Growing up, he was into wrestling, baseball, and was an Army cadet. But at age 15, Neil started drinking and getting into trouble. Neil was not in a gang and did not commit violent crimes, but he did commit petty crimes. As a result, he was sent to live in a community group home for his criminal activity. The home was located at 211 Street West. Neil had permission to be away from the group home for a few days, but did not return when his time expired. He was absent without permission and a warrant was issued for him. He was close with the group home manager, and she always told her boys at the home to call her if they needed any help, and she would pick them up right away. On Saturday, November 24th, 1990, Neil and his mother were talking at her home, located at 38 Confederation Crescent on the west side of Saskatoon. He promised his mom that he would turn himself in after the weekend. He also called the group home manager at about 7:30 p.m. and said that she could pick him up around noon the next day, on Sunday, November 25th. She tried to talk him into coming back immediately when she spoke to him on the phone, but Neil had already been drinking and wanted one last night out with his friends. Earlier in the day, Neil met up with his friend Jason Roy. They had been hanging out at their friend Julie Binning's house. Neil was casually dating her, and she was also friends with Jason's girlfriend Cheryl. He wanted to go to her house to see his friend Eddie Rushton. Julie lived a few blocks away from Neil at 3269 Milton Street. At about 2 p.m., the boys left and caught a bus to see their friend Trevor across town. On the way back, Neil seen his ex-girlfriend Lucille Neitz on the bus with her boyfriend Gary Horse. Lucille said she was babysitting her sister Claudine's kids that night at an apartment building called Snowberry Downs. Neil asked for the apartment number, but she refused to give it to him. She knew Neil planned on drinking that night and knew that he sometimes got rowdy when drinking. Jason Roy had also run into someone he knew while they were out, and they loaned him $20. The boys then hung out at Circle Park Mall until about 6:30 p.m. They went back to Neil's house, and his older brother Marcel went to buy them a bottle of vodka. I think this is about the time he called the group home manager. The boys then went back to the Binning residence and drank the bottle of vodka. Before he left, his mother tried to get him to stay home because the weather was very cold that night and it was snowing, but he insisted he would be okay. Marcel went to the Binnings later that night to check on Neil. He was told that he left with Jason Roy. Eddie Rushton had told Marcel that they were possibly trying to get more money for alcohol by breaking and entering. Not sure if this meant looking through cars or what. Jason would later say that they were headed to Snowberry Downs to see Lucille. This is about a 15-minute walk from the Binning residence and is located at the intersection of 33rd and Confederation Drive. Before arriving at the Snowberry Downs, the boys stopped at a 7-Eleven across the street to warm up. The temperature that night would drop to negative 28 degrees Celsius. Jason also said he might have tried to buy something at the store, but could not remember if they sold it to him. I am not sure if he was referring to alcohol. Jason does not really remember because he and Neil were pretty drunk at this point. Snowberry Downs is made up of 3 apartment buildings, and they have a secured door and a buzzer system. Because Neil did not have the unit number, they had to buzz around and ask for Lucille. They also checked the mailboxes for the name Neats, but did not see any with that name. After a little while, Jason was getting cold and told Neil that they should go back to 7-Eleven to warm up. Neil cussed at him and told him to leave. Jason started making his way back to the store, but changed his mind and was trying to catch up with Neil. He saw him walking ahead of him, but he tripped and fell. He lost track of Neil and tried to find him, but never seen him after this. It was later learned that Neil did make it into one of the apartment buildings and entered one of the units, but was pushed out by the occupant. The unit was the one where Lucille was, but I am unsure if Neil knew this. Her sister's boyfriend, Trent Ewert, arrived home at the same time. Neil was in the building and he followed him inside. Lucille would say that she had seen Neil through the peephole and he was wobbly, so she knew he had been drinking. She would also say that he did not appear to be injured in any type of way. The following timeline is what was pieced together at an inquiry into Neil's death that was led by Commissioner Justice David Wright. It began in September 2003. Constables Larry Hartwig and Bradley Sanger deny having any contact with Neil on his last night alive. They have never admitted to picking him up, but the inquiry did find that the constables chose to conceal their involvement. Lucille told Trent to call the cops after Neil tried to enter the apartment, and the call was received at 11:49 p.m. At 11:51 p.m., a dispatch call went out for Snowberry Downs that said, "Drunk to be removed, Neil Stonechild, 17 years old." Constables Larry Hartwig and Bradley Sanger were both assigned to the District 8 on the west side of Saskatoon on Saturday, November 24, 1990. Larry had been on the force for a little over 3 years at this time, and Bradley Sanger was new and was coming up on his first year of service. The constables responded to this call and pressed the en route button immediately after it went over the airwave. Sometime before finding Neil, they coincidentally stopped his cousin Bruce Janelle, who also lived in Snowberry Downs. He was walking down Confederation Drive to a friend's house. They asked him if he was Neil Stonechild and said there was a disturbance at 7-Eleven. There was never a call to 911 about a disturbance at 7-Eleven. It has never been found out what this was about, but the inquiry concluded that this was indeed a separate incident that was more than likely heard about by the constables on the street that night. Bruce told them, "No, that's my cousin." He had to show them his ID before they believed him. They wrote his name down and let him be on his way. Bruce has added that he never heard Neil at the apartment building looking for Lucille or saw him in the police car when it stopped. Because of this, it is thought they stopped Bruce sometime between 10 p.m. and 11 p.m., and that they were looking for Neil before the disturbance at Snowberry was called in. At 11:56 p.m., the constables pressed the "at scene" button, meaning they arrived at Snowberry Downs. And this is where the timeline starts to get sketchy. They probably arrived at Snowberry Downs a few minutes before because after losing track of Neil, his friend Jason Roy started walking down Confederation Drive back to the Binning residence. Jason was stopped by Hartwig and Sanger. At the same time, the "at scene" button was pressed by one of the constables at 11:56 p.m. They had stopped him after they pulled out of an alley next to the Twin Gable Apartments located on Confederation Place, which is a little over a quarter mile away from Snowberry Downs. Jason said that Neil was handcuffed in the back seat and had blood on his face. He screamed, "Jay, help me, these guys are going to kill me." Jason was wanted for a probation violation at the time and gave the false name of his cousin, Tracy Lee Horse. While Jason was waiting for this name to be cleared, they asked if he knew Neil. He said no because he had warrants and did not want to be in the back seat too. They let Jason go and started driving south down Confederation Drive. Jason said that Neil was looking out the back window and looked scared. Jason just assumed he was going to juvenile lockup because of his warrant. He had no other reason at the time to suspect anything different. A CPIC search was done on Neil's name at 11:59 p.m., but they used the age of 18 years old. His warrant more than likely showed up during this search. It was thought that a different age was used, so if ever questioned, the constables could say that Neil was not in their presence when they ran his name. They then ran Bruce Janil's name at 12:04 a.m. There was no reason to do this because they let him go earlier and he was not in their presence. At 12:17 a.m., Hartwig and Sanger hit the in-service button, saying that they cleared the call at Snowberry Downs. They listed GOA, meaning that the suspect, Neil Stonechild, was gone on arrival. This would indicate that they did not see him, but this was a lie. Jason had just seen them with Neil about 20 minutes earlier. Then right after going back into service, they were dispatched a few blocks away from Snowberry Downs at 12:18 a.m. They hit the at scene button at 12:24 a.m. They were supposedly just getting off the call at Snowberry Downs, and it took them 6 minutes to get there. They then hit the in-service button at 12:27 a.m. and said the suspect was gone on arrival. The inquiry found that the constables had adequate time to drive Neil to the area he was found after leaving Jason Roy at about 11:57 p.m. The route on Google Maps lists a drive time of 12 minutes one way. They more than likely drove a little faster than the speed limit and could have driven out a little further than the place Neil was found because it appeared he had been walking for a while. At 12:30 a.m. they ran the name Trent Ewert. He was the one who made the original call about Neil at Snowberry Downs. Larry Hartwig and Bradley Sanger left this call and there was no reason to run his name now. Jason Roy made it back to the Binnings about an hour and a half to 2 hours after leaving with Neil. Everyone asked where Neil was. He told them he got picked up by the police. The next day on November 25th, his brother Marcel went to the Binnings again looking for Neil. He was told that the cops picked him up, but when Neil's mom called on Monday to inquire about his status, they told her he was not in custody. Neil had mentioned to his mom about visiting a friend on a nearby reservation, and she thought maybe he was there. Nobody knew where Neil was. He never called to check in or turn himself in like he promised. The same day, Neil's mom called the police station looking for him on Monday, November 29th, 1990. 2 construction workers were installing a fence at a new business at 830 57th Street. When they started work at 9 a.m., they noticed something in a field about 160 feet behind where they were working, but at first they thought nothing of it. Curiosity set in and one of them started walking towards the object in the field. They came within 10 to 15 feet of the object and realized it was a dead body. The call was taken at 12:54 p.m., and coincidentally the call was taken by Constable Bradley Sanger. He was filling in at the call center that day. An officer arrived 4 minutes later. When Neil was found, he was wearing a Letterman jacket, white t-shirt, red flannel shirt, blue jeans, a double pair of underwear, 2 socks, and 1 shoe. The shoelace was undone on the shoe, and the sock on the bare foot was worn out at the heel and it was dirty. His hands were in the sleeve of his jacket and wrapped around his chest in an attempt to keep warm. He did not have a hat or gloves, and there was a rock in his shoe. Still pictures and video were taken at the scene, and a single set of footprints were observed. They were observed moving north into the field. There were no footprints south of the business where he was found, so it is thought he walked down the street and cut across the field. It was also noted that he fell down about 10 feet from where he was found, got up, and then fell one final time where he was found. It appeared he was desperately trying to find a place to go for help. In his right back pocket was a picture of Lucille that said "To Neil" and 2 pieces of paper with phone numbers. He also had a tattoo of his initials at the base of his right thumb. This, along with the picture, helped identify him. After a search on the computer, they came up with the name Neil Stonechild and confirmed his identity with fingerprints. His family had heard on the news that a body was discovered in a field on the north edge of town. Before being identified, initial reports said it was a man between 30 and 35. Neil would be identified at about 8:30 p.m. the same day he was found, and his mother Stella and brother Marcel were notified of his death at around 9:45 p.m. An autopsy was done the next day, on November 30th, by Dr. Adolph at St. Paul's Hospital. In a report dated on December 5, 1990 by Sergeant Jarvis, who attended the death scene, stated that pathologist Dr. Adolph stated that it was possible Neil could have been dead since November 25th and that he thought it was at least a minimum of 48 hours. Sergeant Jarvis also stated in the report that Dr. Adolph said that there was no sign of foul play and no signs of trauma to the body. Dr. Adolph would later say that Sergeant Jarvis got this wrong and that he told him that there was no evidence of a traumatic death, which is different than saying that there was no trauma to the body. December 5th was the last entry in Neil's case file, and his case was closed. His cause of death was listed as accidental and hypothermia. There were still a lot of unanswered questions in Neil's case before it was closed prematurely. The Saskatoon PD tried to explain why Neil was walking in the area where he was found. They thought he was walking to 60th Street to the Adult Correction Center to turn himself in. But it was about an 8-kilometer walk from Snowberry Downs to where he was found. There was no way he could have walked that far in the middle of winter. Everyone who knew Neil said he would not do so because he was a juvenile and knew that they would not accept his surrender there. Plus, his home and his friends' houses were closer. He could have easily just walked home and waited for the group home manager to pick him up the next day like he planned. When his funeral was held on Monday, December 3rd, 1990, his family and friends noticed 2 large gashes on his nose and marks around his wrists that looked like they were from handcuffs. Jason Roy had not yet told Neil's family that he saw him in the back of a police cruiser. We will talk about this in a minute. The following are known facts that were uncovered during the inquiry into Neil Stonechild's death. Neil's toxicology was sent to the Regina Crime Lab. When the results came back, they went directly to the Saskatoon police and not the coroner, which is common practice. The duty inspector was never notified about Neil's death. This would have triggered an official investigation, but since there was no foul play suspected, they were never notified. There were no common drugs in his system and an alcohol rating of 0.15. Coroner Dr. Brian Fern was asked about what he said about no injuries present on Neil's body. He said he ruled out obvious foul play because he didn't have an injury of any kind. He then said that he did have some injuries, but they would not have caused his death. It is believed that the coroner, pathologist, or police did not check Neil's clothes for blood. The original autopsy report notes abrasions on the nose, cheeks, and knees. There were also 2 circular abrasions on his chest, which I think could have been from a police baton. Neil was exhumed in April of 2001. There was a full-body x-ray done that did not find any other injuries. The previous injuries noted in the original autopsy could no longer be examined due to decomposition. It was found that the injury to his nose was more than likely caused by a pair of handcuffs. A constable named Mackey admitted on the stand that it was common practice for some officers to quote-unquote unarrest people and drop them off without the person's consent. Neil's clothing was destroyed without the family's consent. An officer burned them before his retirement. Neil's family had asked for his clothing back, but were denied. They suspected more was going on with his death and began investigating themselves. Neil's younger brother, Jason Stonechild, knew Constable Ernie Luteet, who was a Saskatoon police officer. Ernie was First Nations and Jason trusted him. He saw the constable in front of an arcade located at Avenue G and 20th Street while he was out on patrol. Jason told him that he heard Neil was at a party near 7-Eleven when Gary Pratt showed up, and he was the one who beat Neil and left him up north. Neil had witnessed Gary assault his friend Eddie Rushton back in August 1990. He was supposed to testify against him, but the charges were dropped. Gary did not know Neil was going to testify against him. And if Gary were to harm Neil, I think the beating would have been a lot more severe than it was. Gary Pratt was cleared as being involved in Neil's death. He even visited Stella and swore to her that he did not do this to Neil. Ernie took it upon himself to make a copy of Neil's file and pass the info he received from Jason onto the major crime unit, but nothing ever became of this. But Ernie also never filed a report. The copy of the file would come in handy later because in 1998, Neil's case file was destroyed. His death was not classified as a homicide, so it had a shelf life of 10 years, but was let go sooner to make room for renovations. Jason Roy made a statement to Sergeant Jarvis on November 30th, 1990, a day after Neil was found, to say he saw him with 2 police officers. But this statement was not in the copied file of Neil's case. Jason Roy did eventually tell Stella about what he saw the last night her son was alive, and she never doubted him. Jason would later say he was arrested in late December of 1990 for his outstanding warrant and was approached about the statement he gave Sergeant Jarvis. He was asked to rethink the statement, and he wrote a new one but left out the part about seeing Neil that night in the back of the police cruiser. He simply ended it by saying he was blacked out and woke up at the Binning residence. And this statement was the one in Neil's file. Jason said he was scared and lied to save his life. The inquiry did determine that his first statement was true and that Neil was in the custody of Constables Hartwig and Sanger. After all of this, Constables Hartwig and Sanger still denied picking up Neil Stonechild that night at Snowberry Downs. Larry Hartwig had 3 previous contacts with Neil over other matters before that night, and he said he knew Neil and his mom. Yet he claims not to remember looking for Neil that night on November 24th, 1990. Constable Sanger took the call about Neil's body being found 4 days after he was known to be alive, and he also says he has no recollection of searching for Neil that night. These officers also said that when Neil was identified, that they did not put the pieces together that they were searching for him that night on November 24th, 1990. When Larry Hartwig left the stand after testifying at the inquiry, he had an uncontrollable smirk on his face. He had absolutely no sympathy for Neil or his family. The inquiry, led by Justice David Wright, released its final report in October 2004 and concluded that Neil was the subject of 2 complaints on November 24th, 1990. Constables Hartwig and Sanger encountered Neil and took him into custody at Snowberry Downs. The injuries to Neil's face were likely caused by handcuffs. The preliminary investigation turned up suspicious circumstances. The investigation into Neil's death was inadequate. Jason Roy's original statement, taken on November 30th, 1990, was never recorded in Sergeant Jarvis's notebook or investigative report. Sergeant Jarvis dismissed important information given to him by 2 Saskatoon police officers. The file was closed on December 5th, 1990, with many unanswered questions. In the years that followed, department heads ignored pleas from Neil's family members to reinvestigate the case. Self-protective and defensive attitudes were present at the inquiry and have been a problem in the past. There was not enough evidence to lay charges, but it was concluded that Neil had contact with the Saskatoon police the night he died. All police cruisers are now equipped with GPS. This was initiated in January of 2004. Larry Hartwig and Bradley Sanger lost their jobs when the inquiry concluded, and an attempt to appeal the inquiry's finding was unsuccessful. They were never charged with anything pertaining to Neil's death, and they still insist that they are innocent and never did anything wrong to Neil. They also continue to have the support of many people who believe this never happened the way the inquiry said. Neil had spoken about wanting to change his life for the better before his tragic passing. He unfortunately never got that chance, or the chance to grow up and start a family. His brother Marcel deeply regretted buying him alcohol the night he died and felt that he contributed to his death. Neil's mother moved back to Manitoba after Neil passed away. She fought so hard for justice that never came. Darrell NIght, the man who made all these investigations possible, moved to British Columbia after testifying in Saskatoon. He passed away in April 2023 at age 56. He was brought home to the Saulteaux First Nation and laid to rest. Thank you so much for watching today's video. If you knew any of these victims, have a personal connection to a Starlight tour, or were in Saskatoon around the time these cases happened, please share your memories down below, and I will see you in my next video.